Hi, my name is Kris Carlson, and I'm the Supervisor of Child and Youth Programs at Thunder Bay Counselling. To recognize Victims and Survivors of Crime Week 2023, we'd like to first start off by thanking the Department of Justice for making these workshops possible. Project partners for Project H.E.A.L include Thunder Bay Counselling and their partnership with Sexual Abuse Center and the Faye Peterson House of Thunder Bay. The idea and focus of the H.E.A.L project is to provide healing, education, assistance, and linkages for parents and caregivers of young people in our community that are at risk, are currently entrenched in, or are having already experienced exploitive situations. Our goal for the project was to learn strategies to reduce the risk and reintegrate young people back into their mainstream life. We're going to learn how to support youth who have been exploited and connect them with local organizations that provide support services. As well, we want to provide parents and caregivers an opportunity to gain an understanding of how exploitation targets, recruits, and maintains its hold on the young people in our communities. We're going to ask for your cooperation in not duplicating, recording, or copying any of the slides or videos without written consent from Thunder Bay Counselling or the H.E.A.L project. During these sessions, we'll be providing you with some suggestions and engagement strategies, but we know that each and every family is unique and encourage you to reach out to resources located in your community or online to make sure that you are meeting your family's specific needs. Our agenda for the pre-recorded seminar tonight is understanding the impact of exploitation on the teenage brain, exploring appropriate treatment options, and identifying online resources for caregivers. We'd like to start off tonight with understanding that we're going to be talking about some very heavy topics. We're going to be challenging some ideas and the way that we think about exploitation and how it impacts our young people. We understand that sometimes while doing these talks, we understand that we're going to be triggering wounds for families and individuals. So we'd like to please make sure that you're taking the time that you need for yourself and to make sure that when watching the videos after that you have supports available to you. So we're going to start off by talking about the teenage brain and how different it is from the regular brain. You can see from this very funny picture on your screen that the brain's divided into many different compartments. As we mature from children to adults, our brain undergoes some massive changes. Some of the most important ones that we need to identify are that the prefrontal cortex starts pruning networks through adolescence, which helps the brain become more efficient. This allows for huge expansion in skills. During the time of adolescence, this is when young people are out there creating all new experiences. It's sometimes why we might think of young people as being more impulsive or not thinking through things as much as we would like them to. The frontal and parietal lobes of the brain similarly reinforce the most important connection. This shows up in the brain scans as the notable increase in white matter. As these changes happen, some brain areas develop more quickly than others, and this is what impacts our behavior. So for example, areas associated with reward tend to develop faster than those linked to self-control. And like I said earlier, this is what encourages impulsive decision-making. When we think about the teenage brain development by age, we know that it is divided in two very specific age categories. So when we're thinking about how we implement and work with young people, it's important that we know that from 13 to 15 years of age, the teenage brain develops very differently than it does at 16 to 17. In the stages of 13 to 15 years, young people might feel as though acceptance and belonging are the most important things that are happening in their lives. They are extremely influenced by their peers and the peers' behavior. They're vulnerable to those who offer insincere flattery, which makes them the highest at risk for exploitation. They feel that how they look and what others think of them is one of the most important things. And they often are comparing themselves to their peers in an effort to define who they are. They're going to take huge emotional risks in search of finding out and locating their identity. And they're going to have a pseudo maturity about them. And they feel that they can handle more than they are actually ready to developmentally. They are extremely sensitive and very easily humiliated. This is one of the key factors in making them at risk for exploitation and more likely to keep secretive behaviors or sextortion type behaviors to themselves. During the ages of 16 to 17 years of age, young people are going to be experimenting with various roles in an effort to figure out whom they are. They're going to appear to have a fully developed identity, but are not yet fully mature enough to accept that as a permanent structure. They're going to object strongly to all narrow limitations in their self-image. This means as parents, when we try and impact or instill our influence on them, it's likely to be met with resistance. They're going to have an increased focus on what will happen in the future. They're going to prioritize friendships over family. They're going to be seeking independence and expect large amounts of privacy. They're going to have an established sexual identity and be seeking out intimacy. And they can have intense romantic relationships and increased sexual desires. Next, we're going to talk about and watch a video around attachment theory. Understanding attachment theory and the impact that it'll have in our young people's lives will help us understand and implement the proper therapies in place after exploitation.
To get to know who they are. The attachment theory argues that a strong emotional and physical bond to one primary caregiver in our first years of life is critical to our development. If our bonding is strong and we are securely attached, then we feel safe to explore the world. We know that there is always that safe base, which we can return to any time. If our bond is weak, we feel insecurely attached. We are afraid to leave or explore a rather scary-looking world because we are not sure if we can return. People who are securely attached are said to have greater trust, can connect to others, and as a result are more successful in life. Insecurely attached people tend to mistrust others, lack social skills, and have problems forming relationships. There is one type of secure attachment, and there are three types of insecure attachments: anxious ambivalent, anxious avoidant, and anxious disorganized. In responses to distress, the first three react organized, while the last acts disorganized. To understand the theory better, let's look at Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who have 4 children: Luca, Anne, Joe, and Amy. The Smiths are lovely parents who cuddle, make frequent eye contact, speak warmly, and are always there for their kids. But one day, Mr. Smith falls very sick and dies. For Mrs. Smith, life now becomes very difficult. She spends all day working, while at the same time trying to care for her children. An impossible task. At 6 years of age, Luca's brain is for the most part developed, his character strong and his worldview shaped. The new situation does not affect him much. He knows there is still always Mum, his safe haven. He feels securely attached. Later, he turns into a trusting and optimistic young man. His self-image is positive. Anne, who is 3, has problems coping with the new lack of attention. To Anne, her mother now acts unpredictably. She is anxious about their relationship and as a result becomes clingy. To get her mum's attention, she has to raise her emotional state and scream. When her mum finally reacts with a predictable response, she herself acts ambivalent and doesn't show her true feelings. Later in life, others think Anne is unpredictable or moody. Her self-image is less positive. Her attachment style is anxious ambivalent. 2-year-old Joe spends his days with his uncle, who loves him, but thinks that a good education means being strict. If little Joe shows too much emotion or is too loud, his uncle gets angry and sometimes punitive. This scares Joe. He learns that to avoid fear, he has to avoid showing his feelings, also in other situations. As an adult, he continues this strategy and has problems entering relationships. His image of himself is rather negative. His attachment is anxious avoidant. Amy, who is just 1 year old, gets sent to a nursery. The staff there is poorly trained, overworked, and often very stressed. Some are outright abusive. Amy therefore becomes anxious of the very people she seeks security from, a conflict which totally disorganizes her ideas about love and safety. As she is experiencing fear without resolution, she tries to avoid all social situations. As an adult, she thinks of herself as unworthy of love. Her self-image is very negative. Her attachment is anxious, disorganized. Our attachment is formed in the very first years of our lives, a time when we are too young to communicate our anxiety and as a result can experience high levels of stress. Then our adrenal gland, an organ sitting on top of our kidneys, produces the stress hormones adrenaline and cortisol. The heart rate increases, the blood pressure goes up, and we become alert. If that happens frequently, it is called toxic stress. Toxic because it impairs the development of a child's brain and weakens the immune system. In embryos or at a very young age, toxic stress can even switch the expressions of genes, which can affect our health many decades later. By simulating a strange situation, we can assess an attachment style already by the age of 1. To do this, we let the child play with their mother for a few minutes inside a room. Then the child is left alone. The key moment is the child's reaction when her mother returns. Securely attached children first usually hug their mother, then can calm down and eventually get back to playing. Insecurely attached children can be ambivalent and avoidant. Some can't stop crying or refuse to continue playing. The long-term effects of our attachment in the early years are well documented. Using the theory, researchers at Minnesota University were able to predict already at age 3 if a child would drop out of high school with 77% accuracy. In another study, undergraduates at Harvard were asked to assess how close they felt to their parents. 35 years later, they were asked about their health. 91% of those who said they had a rather broken relationship with their mother were also diagnosed with health issues, including coronary artery disease, hypertension, and alcoholism. For those that had reported a warm relationship, the figure of poor health diagnosis was just 45%. But there is another reason why the early years deserve special attention. They are the starting place for subsequent behaviors. A kid that feels securely attached at age 2 can make friends at kindergarten. Their worldview gets reinforced with every interaction and they develop optimism. As a result, they make good relationships at school, then at college, and later at work. Highly insecurely attached children can miss out on this opportunity. Psychologist John Bowlby, a pioneer in attachment theory, allegedly said, "What cannot be communicated to the mother cannot be communicated to the self." In other words, those who feel insecurely attached might not quite understand themselves. To get to know who they are and what they feel, they might have to go way back in time.
So understanding attachment theory will really help us understand the way that we engage young people who are at risk of, are currently entrenched in, or have been impacted by sexual exploitation. Another grouping of things we need to think about is the ACEs, sometimes known as adverse childhood experiences. It's important that we understand that adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are potentially traumatic events that occur in a child's life between 0 to 17. These can include physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse / exploitation, domestic violence, parental substance misuse, mental illness, suicide or death, and crime or imprisonment of family. Knowing that a young person is already potentially impacted by either the attachment or the ACEs will really help us understand how trauma affects the brain. So when thinking about how trauma affects the brain, we're going to talk a little bit about the prefrontal cortex. So this is the part of the brain that manages rational thinking, regulates emotions such as fear responses from the amygdala. With PTSD, this has a reduced volume. The hippocampus is responsible for memory and differentiating between past and present. It works to remember and make sense of the trauma. With consistent exposure to trauma, your hippocampus actually shrinks. The amygdala is what is wired for survival. So when activated, it's hard to think rationally. And the more hyperactive the amygdala is, the more signs of PTSD that will be present. During sexual exploitation, a victim's sympathetic nervous system releases stress hormones throughout the brain, preparing for a fight or flight response, leaving the mind and body in complete survival mode. After exploitation, a victim's brain undergoes a biological change, similar to those who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, such as like first responders and war veterans. These changes bring on a continued activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which will continue to release stress hormones that exhaust the body and the mind of the victim. In addition to this, two parts of the brain are forever changed. The amygdala. So understanding that the almond-shaped mass located deep inside our brain becomes overstimulated and associates that traumatic experience with specific emotions. It has falsely identified harmless situations and individuals as threats because it's constantly in a state of hypervigilance and overstimulation. Talking about the prefrontal cortex, so remembering that this is the last to fully mature and is still developing up until 25 years of age. This handles planning, attention, and impulse control, among other related issues, and it helps to keep other areas of the brain functioning appropriate. Sexual exploitation leaves survivors hypervigilant, paranoid, and can worsen their academic performance due to its impact on this part of the brain. Again, the hippocampus is the part of the brain that becomes less active after trauma. The stress hormone kills its cells and weakens its ability to consolidate memories, and it inhibits the ability to understand the violent event that happened in the part, and it's no longer an immediate threat. So childhood exploitation is known to be a strong predictor of lifelong psychopathy. So research suggests that sexual trauma can impact the brain's ability to recognize and feel sensations by changing the somatic sensory aspect of the cortex. This causes a decrease in sexual sensation and desire, and even chronic pains in part of the bodies that were impacted by the abuse. We often see this in survivors that we're working with. We see them often described as overreactive, inability to self-regulate. They often need people in their lives constantly that can mirror appropriate behavior, and they often will make big responses out of situations that normally previous to the exploitation would have not have bothered them. It's important that we understand that until we start implementing treatment and therapy responses to these young people, their brain is going to continue to create these ideals and make every day extremely difficult for them. I want to talk a little bit about trauma bonding. So trauma bonding is what happens during sexual exploitation. This is the process of recruitment, the grooming and gaming, the coercion manipulation stages. During that, we will see trauma bonding taking place. So trauma bonding is the linking concept for topics of attachment and trauma. As they relate to sexual exploitation, trauma bonding is also sometimes known as Stockholm syndrome, or also known as trauma coerced attachment. It can be defined as dynamic, cyclical state in which victims form a powerful emotional attachment to their abuser. Trauma bonding usually does not occur as a result of one abusive incident, but instead, when victims are intermittently exposed to a mixture of both having their basic needs met and by being threatened and abused by the perpetrator. So understanding that there are several pathways to trauma bonding, which usually involve some interaction and a combination of abusive control dynamics and exploitation power imbalances within the relationship. Sexual exploitation, trauma, and attachment versus the reward. So trauma bonds are complex because they're marked not only by the abusive control and dependency survivors have on their abusers, but also by the love and affection. Many individuals who experience trauma coerced attachment lack the sense of belonging to or interaction with desirable social groups. This is what makes them the most at risk. If you remember in our very first day together, we talked about at-risk social groups. These individuals often have a history of relationships characterized by mistrust and betrayal. The complexity of trauma bonds only intensifies the struggles that individuals who are sexually exploited experience in their effort to be free from exploitation. The nature of trauma bonds can result in exploited individuals seeking an escape from the exploitation and the exploiter, while also experiencing a state of uncertainty and grief in their decision to leave, with whom the trauma bond was forged. Understanding that breaking a trauma bond, that there's no one way or easy answer for this to happen, but to break a trauma bond, a victim needs to have an alternative healthy relationship in place that is available and to be isolated from their abuser for a significant period of time. This allows the young person time to heal and come to terms with the trauma that they experience. It gets them to reshape the nature of future relationships. And from observing situations, particularly as a parent, we know that this can be very heartbreaking. But if you are consistent and present as the caregiver in their world, this means that the child is not solely dependent on their abuser. And you need to understand that that is a key relationship that needs to be in place for the trauma bond to stay present. When a young person has a place safe to return to or flee from, return to or flee when things are not well with their abuser, they constantly find it more easy to return to a mainstream lifestyle. So in talking about the 7 stages of trauma bonding, we know that it's love bombing starts as the very first one. It just means that the person who is exploiting them will spend so much time creating a sense of like euphoric lust for this young person. They're going to enter into stage 2 by gaining your trust and getting you hooked. They're going to meet every single basic need that your young person is needing. And remember that our young people have really elaborate ideas of what they need. And oftentimes that can't be met by their caregiver. In stage 3, they're going to create that uneasiness, which will come in the form of criticism and devaluation. So they are going to love on them really hard, and in the very next hour, act ambivalent to them. They want young people to be walking on eggshells and really unsure of how to stay present. Stage 4 is gaslighting. This is making the young person feel like they're going crazy. They will deny that the abuse is taking place and actually question things that have actually happened as not happening. In stage 5, young people will move to resignation and submission. They will seek out any opportunity to receive that love and gratification that they received early on in the stage 1 and stage 2. In stage 6, it's the loss of self. So they are fully reliant on finding that love and attachment in the person who's exploiting them. And then in stage 7, it becomes that emotional addiction, chasing that high of getting it back to when it was good. We know that young people will seek out in relationships when it was the very best of. They're always looking for the best in their exploiter. And so it's really important that we understand that just asking them not to see this person is not going to be the best way in order for us to break the trauma bond. So when we think about some typical symptoms that we might see in a young person who has been sexually exploited, we know that they are going to avoid thinking about the trauma. They're going to have quite significant flashbacks. They're going to have an inability to concentrate on anything, even things that used to bring them so much joy. They're going to be stuck in a negative circle of thinking. They're going to have extensive sleep difficulties, including night terrors, and you will often see them going for long periods of time without sleeping. And then when they finally do sleep, it will last for stages of like 18 to 20 hours. They're going to feel guilt and shame for the exploitation that happened against them. They're going to constantly be in a negative mood. You're going to also hear them complaining about being sick of being tired. So when we actually say sick and tired, they're literally going to have all of those feelings. They're always going to be on guard. They are going to feel that any minimum situation is going to provide heightened hypervigilance and awareness. They're going to feel that even some of the safest people are going to be looking to do them harm. They're going to have, like I said earlier, a loss of interest in things that used to bring them so much joy. And the bad dreams are actually part of the somatic complaint that will often lead them not to want to sleep. So again, when we start thinking about young people exiting away from exploitive situation, it's important that caregivers are ready for some of the typical behaviors that will follow. This is because of the significant trauma that has happened to the brain. So typical acting out behaviors that may occur are them testing your boundaries. They are going to see if you are going to abandon them when times get rough. They are we call this scanning type behaviors. They are going to see if you're going to stick around when things get tough. They're going to resent your power and authority because for early on in the stages of exploitation, they were given a lot of freedom. They were made to believe that they were in control and power, and then that was stripped away from them. And so they are going to have a really hard time reintegrating back to rules and expectations of them. They're going to resist discipline. They have been coerced and bullied and stripped away. And so any form of trying to keep them in a situation that is defined by rules and whatever is going to feel like they naturally have to push back against them. They're finally starting to have a small sense of control in the exiting. And so anybody who tries to take that control away, they're going to be met with very defensive and radical displays of anger and seem to have very little patience. They're going to be frustrated with the rules, and they're going to maintain that even in that unhealthy relationship, the exploitation might seem easier to them. You're going to see them rebel against the rules to see if you're going to be consistent in what you are talking to them and setting expectations around. They are going to think that returning to mainstream life, or sometimes we'll call it regular life, or trying to find regular employment might be pointless. They're likely going to have some substance misuse concerns. They're going to be swearing and having really bizarre views on the way that the world views them and the way that they view society and the world in whole. You might notice some food hoarding behaviors, as well as an eating disorder or the way that they are in control of any aspect that they might have control over their body. They're likely to hide possessions and want to keep their spaces secure and private. So by locking room doors, they might be sleeping with the lights on. And you might notice that they're constantly having a bag packed and that they're ready to leave at a moment's notice. These are very typical behaviors of people who have experienced trauma. It's important that as we work through the different types of treatment options that are available to young people, that adults and caregivers are also looking at the type of treatment and support that they're going to need. And we're going to really cover that in one of the next sessions available, understanding caring practices and self-care for the parent and caregiver. So when we think about treatment options, it's really important that we understand that there's no one-size-fits-all treatment for trauma and or victims and survivors of sexual exploitation. Everyone is different and may respond differently to various types of therapies. However, we do know that there are types of therapies that are more congruent to healing. And I'm going to cover some of those for you. So understanding cognitive behavioral therapy. It is a very common treatment modality for many mental health struggles. It is extremely successful with trauma. You will learn how your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are interconnected with and influence each other. You'll become more aware of your negative thoughts, which give you the power to reframe these negative beliefs, and that might be weighing you down. You might realize that you might have unhealthy thoughts surrounding your trauma, and CBT will be able to help you tackle them. Thinking about a central concept in CBT is that you'll work with identifying your cognitive distortions. So essentially, distorted or unhelpful ways of thinking. Examples of cognitive distortion may include extreme black and white thinking, or all or nothing thinking, and catastrophizing, and are expecting worst possible outcomes. CBT is a very common behavior therapy, and it's very common for people with mental health conditions to be stuck in these thought patterns. CBT also allows you to challenge existing cognitive distortions and in turn develop healthier thought patterns and behaviors that benefit your mental health. This is called cognitive restructuring. So on top of that, your therapist may teach you new ways to cope, such as breathing techniques, mindfulness techniques, or grounding methods to help you reduce your anxiety and stay present when these big feelings come up. These valuable coping skills will be beneficial when you are in a heightened state of emotion and dealing with flashbacks around exploitation. An offshoot of CBT is cognitive processing therapy. In the context of sexual trauma, CPT gives you the power to challenge the negative and unhealthy thoughts and beliefs linked to the exploitation. Doing this will provide you with a healthier way of looking at the incident and empowering you to have a better outlook on life. CBT can be short or long-term. We're going to talk a little bit about prolonged exposure therapy. So prolonged exposure therapy, it becomes adjacent to CBT. It is a type of exposure therapy that is especially helpful for sexual exploitation survivors who may find themselves engaging in avoidant type behaviors. It is common for survivors to avoid things that jog memories surrounding their trauma. For example, they might avoid certain people, places, situation, and memories. Alongside your therapist, who would be trained in exposure therapy, you will gradually expose yourself to these potential triggers when you feel like you're ready and safe to do so. If you continue to avoid situations, it will teach your brain to think that these things are dangerous and support your fear. But if you safely expose yourself and you can retrain your brain to learn that these things are actually safe, that you're in control, and that you don't need to avoid them. Some exposure methods your therapist may include is imaginal exposure. So this involves thoroughly imagining or speaking about the traumatic incident or the triggering situation, and they'll assist you in creating new coping mechanisms for the difficult emotions or physical sensations that are going to pop up for you. Virtual reality or VR therapy exposure takes imagined exposure to another level by incorporating realistic sights and sounds. This will be happening in a controlled and safe environment. In vivo exposure, after working with some imaginal exposure, your therapist will assist you in identifying triggers, such as specific places that you might avoid due to the trauma. Then you devise a plan together to expose yourself in vivo, so in real life, to the triggers between your sessions. You will start small and build up your confidence along the way. So understanding that prolonged exposure therapy is usually used in collaboration with the other theory options and shouldn't be used independently and without the assistance of a trained professional. I want to talk a little bit about trauma-focused CBT because this is a combined theory. So as it's closely related to CBT, trauma-focused CBT was designed specifically for young people and teens who are healing from trauma and their caretakers. So it not only does the trauma-focused CBT help for sexual exploitation survivors cope with their trauma, it allows their caregivers to understand better trauma in general and how to effectively help. Trauma-focused CBT is based on 3 main phases, which are as follows. It will really focus on the stabilization of the young person. So this first phase helps the survivor and their caregiver learn more about trauma, various symptoms, and the lasting effects. If your therapist will help you teach multiple tools for emotional regulation, expressing your feelings, and relaxation techniques. I often think that DBT is a really good option in this stage of the trauma-focused CBT. This will aid you as you cope with your trauma and related symptoms. Tying back to the main principles of CBT, cognitive processing skills will also be taught to help you and your caretakers address any cognitive distortions and unhelpful ways of thinking. So trauma narration and process. With emotional regulation and regulation techniques under your belt, you're going to face your trauma head on in the second phase of trauma-informed CBT. With the guidance of a therapist, you can revisit and process the details of the exploitation in a safe place. You'll learn how to explore their memories and view them in a way that doesn't feel dangerous. During this phase, caretakers will also be able to understand the trauma as well. In the third phase, it includes integration and consolidation. So exposure therapy may come into play. Your therapist will work with you to decide if the exposure can benefit you in your recovery. You will also have sessions with caretakers to help have open and honest conversations. You can create a future safety plans and discuss how to initiate and integrate what you've learned into treatment into your everyday life. So parents and caregivers are really important in the combined theory, which means that families or caregivers will have a parallel treatment alongside the person who has been exploited. The child and adolescent development will be taken into consideration to understand the age-based understanding, needs, and ability. And then the cognitive behavioral therapy will be goal-oriented and collaborative practice that meets both the caregivers and the young person. Oftentimes, when young people have an adult in their life who can be consistent and therapeutic in their treatment, trauma-focused CBT will be the primary source of initial treatment for young people. Anybody who knows me knows that I am a huge successor of EMDR. So EMDR in a nutshell is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, so EMDR. So EMDR works in a unique way, and it was first developed to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. It used to use back and forth eye movements or different types of bilateral, so left and right stimulation of the brain to help process triggering memories related to trauma. In cases where eye movements aren't the right fit for an individual, bilateral stimulation can occur through touch and sound. So there's different types of options for EMDR. Some include different noises happening through the use of headphones and sound. Some use touch by holding paddles, either in your hands. You might even see some therapists who use touch therapy. So tapping their body on different sides or their hands to be able to unlock those sides of the brain. This trauma therapy is based on the theory that the brain stores traumatic memories different than non-traumatic ones. Trauma may be stored in a way that isn't conducive to healing. These distressing memories are linked to emotions, beliefs, and even physical sensations that occurred during the traumatic event. That's why thinking about the trauma can cause such an intense reaction like it's happening right now. This is where EMDR comes in. During EMDR treatment, you will tap into these old memories and adequately process them, changing how they are eventually stored in your brain moving forward. Aside from the fact that this therapy at times can use eye movements or bilateral simulations, we've also talked about that there isn't much talking as in normal and other forms of psychotherapy or talk therapy. At the beginning of treatment, you will recount some memories that you want to work on with your therapist and discuss the trauma. However, when bilateral stimulation occurs, you actually don't talk much during the session. Ultimately, as time goes on with EMDR, you'll become more and more desensitized to the traumatic memory surrounding your exploitation. It means that the memories might be less vivid. Any emotions or physical sensations attached to them will actually be reduced. So thinking about it kind of in the way that your therapist would work with you is that you will review the history, you're going to identify the issue, and you're going to develop a treatment plan. You're going to create a safe space, develop a self-soothing technique, and connect with the inner resources that you have. You're going to identify in the assessment stage the disturbing event and the triggers for those. You're going to identify how you associate this in your emotions, but also in your body sensations. And then you're going to create a positive belief statement that you're going to use instead of. And then by using bilateral stimulation, you're going to react to the new insights and associations to the trauma. You're going to continue until the disturbing emotions are completely reduced. We know that EMDR is usually a longer step process, that it is the most effective in treating high levels of emotional response in bodies. So when we think about why therapy is so important, when you're a survivor of sexual trauma, seeking treatment is crucial for overall mental health and well-being. You do not have to continue to suffer from the flashbacks, distressing emotions, nightmare, shame, guilt, and any other symptoms that you might be feeling. It is important to know that if the exploitation has happened more recently for your young person, then addressing the trauma early might help prevent young people from developing chronic PTSD. If the young person has already developed the chronic PTSD, treatment is still critical to reduce their symptoms and improve both their functioning and quality of life. Therapy is a really great opportunity to work through trauma and address other co-occurring mental health conditions and symptoms. We see that when young people engage in counseling, they tend to have a greater ability to develop their self-confidence. They create healthy and better relationships. They are able to regain their own emotional balance. They are able to create assertiveness, which leads to less risk of re-exploitation. They're able to set boundaries and appropriate rules around their body, but also their feelings. They are releasing that stress, and they come to the stress and anxiety, and they resolve that trauma in a way that makes sense for them. It's really important that while as parents and caregivers, we may feel that we need to be involved in every aspect of your young person's healing journey, we need you to know that young people sometimes need to take the first steps alone to be able to really unpack the risks and concerns that they felt during their exploitation. Remember that young people often are going to feel embarrassed and ashamed talking with their adults about the things that have happened. And often, as we talked about in our very first day, young people who have experienced exploitation will try and protect the people that they feel the closest to by not wanting to talk about the level of violence that was perpetrated against them during their stages of exploitation. So remember how we want to engage our young person after exploitation. So when we think about what young people will need, we know that young people benefit more from predictability. So understanding that not everybody will like surprises. Trauma survivors often prefer a very predictable routine in their everyday life. So setting up clear and consistent expectations will be important for them to know that what they can expect day after day. Understanding their perspective. So knowing that during their exploitation, they probably have some intruding thoughts. And it will be very, very hard for them to self-regulate. You might not agree with the perspective that the young person is having. It's really important that you do not take responsible for what is not yours. You will likely take on guilt because they will become very reactional to you. You cannot take that on. Allow time for the survivor to calm down and to take perspective. Trauma survivors often have difficulty regulating their emotions and will take longer to calm themselves after a triggering event. Also understanding recalibration. So understanding that they live in a constant overreacting, oversensitive, or over anything. We want to take those words out of our vocabulary. We understand that young people are actually having very normal responses to unnormal situations. So their body has learned to survive through things that bodies aren't meant to survive through. So we want to refer to the person, we never want to refer to the person as a problem. We don't want to focus on their behavior, and we want to identify what it is. It is actual trauma response. So we want to give what we also need to receive. So we need to be constantly kind, unwavering in our support, and allowing the person who has been exploited to have some choice in the way, some choice and control in the way that their days are going to roll out for them. So remember that we want to focus on listening. We're going to respect that they're choosing to share rather than asking a lot of questions. It is important not to pressure people who have been exploited, and we need to give them time and talk at their own pace. We have to accept their feelings, allowing them to be upset about what has happened and having a natural response to really big feelings that they're going to be having. This is going to be very hard sometimes, but we have to make sure that we are not blaming them or criticizing their reactions. You might wonder why they didn't do something differently, but they survived. And however they did that needs to be fine. So use the same words that people who have been exploited are using. So people vary in how they prefer to describe their experience. So for example, it's their choice whether they talk about being a victim or a survivor of trauma. If they use the word victim, we mirror that. If they talk about their experience, we mirror that. Never dismiss their experience. For example, don't tell them not to worry about things or that it could be worse. This isn't usually helpful for young people to hear. And we remember that young people can't choose what they find traumatic or how they're impacted. If they're having a trauma experience, it's theirs. We only give advice if you're asked for it. So they might prefer to simply hear that you believe them and that you're going to be there for them in any way that you can be. When we think about some of the core responses that really impact a young person in their healing is genuineness. So I just got to think for genuine people, and young people do too. So when you are using your non-effective, like your nonverbal skills, so just being present, using spontaneity, being non-defensive, and at times you might even want to use some self-disclosure if it is genuinely about that young person. Remember that using self-disclosure inappropriately can actually cause a barrier to the development of the relationship. So it also might have the young person who is in a trauma response feel like it is an attempt to to take over their trauma. And so when using self-disclosure, it should be done very sparingly and with a lot of thought in it. As parents and caregivers, we also have to understand the difference between empathy versus sympathy. So in order to demonstrate empathy, you have to first attempt to understand the feelings that the person with whom you're with. If your young person is experiencing a loss of family and friends and community, it is likely that the child is both sad and angry. To convey empathy, the worker should communicate that they understand with an empathetic response, such as, "You seem to be angry and sad at the same time," without, about having to live on the streets. Sympathy, on the other hand, would generate a response of something like, "Oh, you poor child, you really are at the bottom of the barrel right now. I would feel the same way." So using a sympathy response can actually leave the young person feeling helpless, while empathy response leaves young people feeling open to begin a conversation about their feelings in the situation. So avoid sympathy statements. They often begin with "I," or "I feel sorry for you," or "I'm so happy that you." I don't know how you can get through this. Since self-awareness is critical to one being empathetic, it's common for persons to experience difficulty conveying empathy. When self-awareness is missed, the attempt to be empathetic is lost in one's own confusion about this. So remembering that sometimes feeling with what the person feels, just listening to what they have to say, do it without judgment. Be aware of the nuances and nonverbal cues that you might be putting off, and discovering their perspective, asking them how they view the situation, and acknowledge that their feelings are powerful and important. The third key, I think, is just positive self-regard. In essence, this is just about being respectful. So unconditional positive regard is the idea of just accepting them as they are. This is a wonderful quote by Carl Rogers. "People are just as wonderful as sunsets if you let them be." When I look at a sunset, I don't find myself saying, "Soften the orange a little bit on the right-hand corner." I don't try to control a sunset. I watch in awe as it unfolds. And that's what we need to do with our young people. Having unconditional positive regard is just accepting them. This means that you as the caregiver and the young person in the position of exploitation need to be given dignity and value just because they're another human being. So it means that respect is offered without conditions, regardless of the situation, and nothing is expected in return. We're not using bribes for conditions for getting something in return. And it is really, really important that we are responsible for getting, we're not giving responsibility for them to get respect. So they're getting respect no matter what. Everyone deserves respect, regardless of any situation. The main behavior and attitude needed to show respect is to be non-judgmental. So in reality, not everyone likes everyone. However, for the relationship to be created, we need to put aside our personal biases. So understanding that the need for self-awareness is critical in order to show respect and positive self-regard. Respect boundaries. Try and also hold back strong reactions to the disclosures of what has happened to them in exploitation. We accept them And we want to become the warm place where young people can land. So warmth. Warmth in a relationship refers to being approachable and open. So understanding and providing warmth to young people means taking into consideration all of the following tasks. Understanding that that young person who has been through exploitation is equal of the same worth that we are. We are going to hold them in relationship, absence of blame, in non-defensive, but close to us. We need to understand that these young people need warmth, and thinking of it more as a feeling and a state of mind rather than a behavior. However, many nonverbal expressions represent warmth. So remember that a young person might attempt to demonstrate warmth. The receiver might not feel it. Other restraints to accepting warmth will also come from if in the past they have had that experience. So you have to remember the stages of exploitation. Young people are often given warmth and caring and what they believe as positive regard. However, we know that that is then taken away from them very quickly. Know that this will take a really long time in creating relationships with your young person. So don't expect this to be a one and done kind of engagement. Everything that I've really talked about today will take time and reassurance in the life of a young person who's exploited. But when we are consistent in the delivery of these things, we will find that young people will turn to us in their greatest times of need. So I want to talk a little bit about, in offering warmth, be aware that 4 considerations should be there. The young person is perceived of equal worth and is blameless, that this is demonstrated both verbally and non-verbally, and that when we present ourselves in non-defensive ways and we're attempting to create closeness, we ourselves need to be vulnerable to what the young person is saying. So during these times, young people will feel very reactive and uncertain that we are going to be consistent in this care. But when we do this, we will open up an opportunity for them that they have not had in a really long time. So in thinking about resources to help support families and caregivers, please check out the following websites. So protectchildren.ca, missingkids.org, the ctinstitute.com, and the helpguide.org. You can also make sure that you're checking out YouTube for videos on trauma and the ongoing impact on young people through exploitation. And if you're looking for resources locally here in Thunder Bay, you can check out www.humantraffickingthunderbay.ca. This will help you locate local resources to identify a therapist that will be able to help meet the needs of your family, and identify resources to potentially help assist in payment should cost be a barrier to seeking help. So on behalf of Thunder Bay Counselling and our partnered agencies, Faye Peterson House and the Sexual Abuse Center of Thunder Bay, we'd like to thank you for participating in this session of the H.E.A.L project.